When my sister's engagement party was still a month away and my father's voice could cut glass across a table, I found myself 11 years old again in the hot shadow of our Scarsdale boxwood. I'm Logan Reynolds, and the sound of men arguing over wine labels snaps me back to afternoons where the Reynolds name opened doors, where our address did more talking than we did. I can still see my mother, Susan, smoothing her skirt like she smoothed reputations, introducing me to people as if I were a scarf she chose to wear that season. "This is Logan, he'll be in business," she'd say with the casual certainty of someone assigning both future and posture. My father's handshake was a statement. Robert Reynolds, private equity, measuring life in zip codes and college acceptances. My sister Emily practiced her closing arguments with the same neatness she used to fold napkins, and my brother Matt memorized market moves before most kids learned multiplication. They were perfect fixtures in a life that valued title over truth, and I learned early that worth was spoken aloud and confirmed by anyone willing to look at our house and nod. The garden parties felt like rehearsals for a play I was never cast in, guests in linen, the clink of crystal, and my mother orbiting us like a satellite of proper introductions. I remember her once introducing me to a neighbor as our little accessory, and the word lodged like a stone in my throat. I always found my way back to the kitchen, where things were loud and honest and didn't pretend. Rosa Alvarez, who had been working for us since before I could reach the counter, saw me watching and didn't chase me off. She taught me how to hold a knife so it felt like an extension of my hand, how to make a basic stock until it tasted like patience. Rosa would laugh when my fingers throbbed from the cold, and she would press my wrist until the sting was gone, and then she'd guide my grip until it was steady. In the kitchen, I could make something that didn't care about my last name. It only cared if I added salt at the right time. Heat smelled like clarity, and burns were badges of progress, not marks of shame. I remember the suffocating comfort of that heat when the rest of the house wanted me to be a model son and the pans clanged like an honest metronome. I started with late-night loaves, the kind that require patience and more flour on your jeans than in the dough. Bread rose in the tiny oven of my college apartment while I shelled bread crumbs into bowls and wrote notes in the margins of textbooks meant for finance students. I hosted secret dinners for people who liked food better than names, students, women's studies professors, a tattoo artist who liked his steak rare and his stories rare too. Those dinners paid for my first knives and taught me how to read a room and a recipe at the same time. When I finally said it out loud, when I told my father I wasn't going to the business school he expected me at, he laughed like I had told a joke that failed. "Culinary school?" he asked, his tone a mixture of disbelief and performance, like he was auditioning for a role called disappointed father. My mother looked at me as if I had mispronounced a family verb. Emily tightened her lips into a polite smile that felt like a curtain closing. "I love to cook," I said, and the two words were all I could find to hold the place of every plan he had already made. He asked how I would make money. He called it servant work in front of a cousin who worked in wealth management as if that would make the idea sink. He asked whether I had thought about our name, and I watched his eyes measure me against a brand he had built. I won't pretend there wasn't shame on my side too, an ember of guilt that I had chosen something small seeming in a house that flared for status. But Rosa had taught me that fire transforms, and the kitchen had taught me I could be more than his definition. I walked out that day feeling like I had both wrenched a truth from my chest and set something free, and I remember the way the back door clicked shut behind me with the bright certainty of a closing bell. I kept two lives like I kept two watches, one for my parents, polished and predictable, and another that ran louder and faster in my chest. By day, I sat in business lectures at a respected school because that's what would soothe my mother and make my father nod. I answered case study questions with a practiced calm and wrote the kind of notes that would impress admissions officers. By night, my apartment smelled like butter and yeast, and my hands remembered recipes better than I remembered accounting formulas. I signed up for food electives the way other kids took wine tastings, furtive, indulgent, full of guilt and joy. I wanted both worlds to think I was playing along. My apartment became a small, illegal thing of its own. I hosted supper clubs in a place that had 3 beds and a tiny oven that charred more than it cooked at first. Friends and strangers paid in cash for a seat at my table and for the chance to eat something honest. We ate by candlelight on borrowed plates while I pretended to be casual about the nerve I felt. I would take weekend shifts in local kitchens, dish pits first, then prep, then line learning the rhythm of orders and the language of the pass. The work was physical and immediate and unapologetic. I found a kind of truth there that contrasted with the polished sterility of my carefully plotted evenings at the business school. One winter evening, I catered an alumni reception on campus, a bland spread meant to signal success. I snuck one of my own things onto the menu, A small plate of roasted beets with brown butter and hazelnut, the kind of texture I loved, the kind that makes people pause. Laurent Duper tried it. He was a roomer, a French chef with 3 Michelin stars who had a presence that felt like weather. After he ate my dish, he didn't clap or compliment in the casual way older men parroted praise. He just silenced the room and said, without irony, "You make sense on a plate." He found me awkwardly standing near the bleachers and handed me a business card written in a hand that never wasted ink. His card was thin and folded like a note from a teacher who knew the answer before you asked. Chef Laurent's invitation was not a gentle suggestion. It was an uncompromising offer that sounded like a challenge. "Come to New York," he said, voice low, "and cook on a real line. You have instinct. We will sharpen it." The card smelled faintly of smoke and something floral, cologne, or dish soap, and I carried it that whole week as if the paper could bend my future into a different shape. I went home and held it under my pillow like a prayer I wasn't allowed to say aloud. Quitting the MBA program felt like stepping off a cliff where everyone below assumed my fall would be private and messy. It was a moral crossroads because it was where my honest desire collided with what my family had already decided I should be. I called my father. I told him I was going to culinary school. His voice didn't rise. It set into a tone that was colder than any shout and cut in its own way. "We invested in you to be a Reynolds of the market," he said. "You are not throwing that away for pastries." My mother said nothing at first, which was worse. Silence in her house was always loaded with meaning. Emily offered a small, thin, performative concern that felt like a litigation statement. Matt smirked like this was a joke that would end soon. The words were sharp and theatrical, crafted to wound, but also to keep the narrative where they wanted it. "Think of our name," my father told me, as if a last name could be litigated like property. "Think of appearances," my mother said, which sounded like a verdict. They treated my choice as if it were an embarrassment to be managed, not a life to be lived. I felt fury, but under that was something quieter and deeper. An ache that came from realizing the people you love most might never see what your hands could do as anything other than a deviation. I packed a small bag for New York with reverence and fear, the card folded and living on top of the shirts, and stepped into a future that would not be approved by the people who built my past. I slept in a room that smelled like other people's takeout and the damp of too many bodies. A cramped Queen's apartment with roommates who kept different hours and louder anxieties than me. I learned to set my alarm by the sound of someone else's shower and to boil water for coffee with my eyes half closed. My day began before dawn at a bakery where the ovens bloomed heat and flour stuck to my shirt like dust from a job that never ended. I worked 16-hour days, bakery prep, midtown line kitchens that screamed ticket times, and prep shifts that required a kind of mechanical mercy. I carried exhaustion like a second jacket and learned not to complain about the weight. Money was a tight pulley. I took small loans for culinary school and paid them back with an urgency that felt shameful and holy at the same time. I tipped my last dollar into a tool I trusted, knives that fit my hand and the textbooks I studied after midnight under a cheap lamp. My hands earned their history there, scars across knuckles, blisters on the pads of fingers, a permanent burn along the side of one thumb where a pan had leapt at me in a rush hour. Those marks read like transcripts I could hold against anyone's diploma. They were proof in a language my parents never learned to read. I learned sauces by repetition until emulsions stopped surprising me, turned simple stocks into language, and practiced technique until muscle memory was a new kind of faith. Chef Laurent Duper was not theatrical. He was precise and terrifying in a calm way. He moved through the line with a concentration that felt religious, and he didn't spare anyone's ego while he sharpened their craft. Under his tutelage, my instinct began to gain sentences. He corrected my wrist once and said, "Without drama, speed without grace is noise." He had a way of pushing until you either broke or became better, and most of the time you became better because breaking meant you got fired. Within 3 years under him, I went from a kid who couldn't hold a pan without flinching to a man who could run a section and direct the flow of service. I was exhausted, sure, but there was momentum now, each night of praise and critique carving out muscles I didn't know I had. The whispering started in the kind of quiet that spreads through a kitchen when service ends and people finally breathe. Industry ears are always listening. Reputations travel on the same gossip that later powers reviews. The first real taste of momentum came at a farewell supper when Laurent was doing something extravagant and the room smelled like butter and singed herbs. Gavin Brooks, an investor who usually moved money like he moved chess pieces, sat at the counter and tasted my food the way a man checks the weather. He leaned back, surprised without being showy, and asked what every ambitious cook prays someone will ask. "Who's running the kitchen?" The question hung in the wash of dishwater and steam like a promise, and later he found me by the walk-in and said, "If you're open to it, I'd like to talk about funding." The financial arc wasn't a fairy tale. Gavin and two other early partners helped me assemble roughly $2.8 million in development capital, an amount that covered a real space, real equipment, and those impossible city permits. We opened a tight, sharp restaurant with a name that meant nothing until it meant everything to us. Early reviews liked the clarity. Trade magazines used words like precise and singular in the way that made chefs smile and investors lean forward. The restaurant turned a profit faster than anyone expected, and the numbers began to speak for themselves. I negotiated late nights and early mornings to buy myself some steak, and when the time came I leveraged the restaurant's performance, took bank-backed loans against our earnings, and slowly purchased full ownership from the partners for roughly $1.2 million combined. An ugly, clean, necessary transaction that made the business finally mine. I remember signing the last buyout paper with ink-smudged fingers that still smelled faintly of time, feeling relief that was equal parts exhaustion and vindication. The scars on my hands had a new grammar now. They were not just survival marks but badges of a life I chose. People started to say my name in rooms where I used to listen, and Lawrence said nothing dramatic, just a look that said, "I told you so." The city began to know the restaurant as a place of rigor and warmth, and I learned that building something that matters takes more than talent. It takes the willingness to be broke, tired, corrected, and relentless until the numbers finally match the taste. When I finally had the keys and the kitchen heat under my own name, I spent weeks trying to describe Asteria before we even opened, but words failed and smell did not. I wanted an aroma nobody could mistake for anything else. The slow nutty burn of brown butter, a faint citrus brightness that came from lemon verbena I insisted on getting twice a day, and a low undercurrent of roasted bones that smelled like patience. I ordered custom plates from a potter in Brooklyn, each one slightly different in the way a human face is different from another, concave centers that cradled sauces and rims that caught light. The restaurant was small by design, the dining room intimate enough that you could hear a laugh travel, but theatrical enough that when the cloche lifted at the pass, it felt like a reveal without being a circus. We had delivery windows like church services, herbs arriving at 9 in the morning and again at 3, tiny boxes of mint, tarragon, and lemon verbena that smelled like the front yard of home in a better way. The twice-daily herb delivery became part of the choreography. The runner would dump the cardboard and the kitchen would inhale it, and the scent would ride into the dining room like an unannounced guest. I curated an experience where the food spoke first and loudest, but the room had a confidence about it, a quiet light that let plates mean something. I asked the team to care about the weight of forks and how a napkin folded because small things compound into trust. There was a line where intimacy met theater, and I learned to walk it without falling into either extreme. Critics write in the future tense until you give them something real, and press arrives with teeth mostly hidden. The first real triumph came slow and then sudden, a feature in Food and Table that called Asteria cleanly ambitious, and a city review piece that used the word necessary as if it were a verdict. The reservations calendar filled month by month until we had a waiting list that read like an occupation roster. People who once dismissed my career in a sentence began to say my name in other people's rooms. When reviewers applauded, the staff clapped harder than anyone. The applause at the end of service was for them, for line cooks who had learned to steady hands, and for servers who moved like quiet conductors, and for someone absent, for the son who had left home and wouldn't be placated by cheap signs of status. I kept my family at arm's length while we climbed, not because revenge felt satisfying, but because I needed to prove the life to myself first. I sent the occasional holiday card with a short note and made sporadic calls that were the shape of civility more than intimacy. Susan got one of those cards every December, the same white envelope she preferred, as if our rhythms still shared a postal route. My father got updates in the form of a sentence when someone asked about investments, like a footnote in a larger ledger he was still writing. I never took a single contact from my parents to open doors. I remember one night when Lauren asked why I wouldn't use the family's names or friends to get a quicker table on opening night. I told him I needed the restaurant to be mine. He nodded like someone who understood ownership was more than money. People assume the refusal to use family connections is spite, and some nights I felt like feeding that rumor. The truth is simpler and uglier. I wanted to know I could bear the weight without their scaffolding. I wanted proof that my hands, not their network, could build a place where people felt something real. That motive has a moral clarity that is not showy. It is a slow burn you carry through seasons. I wanted to answer to my own standards and sleep without the taste of their approval in my mouth. When Emily texted an invitation to her engagement dinner the summer after our second season, I read it and felt a complicated thing that tasted like both hunger and absence. So Asteria became my thesis and my confession, a room that held the best of my craft and the history that made me. People came for the scent, for the plates, for the way the parsley broke when you touched it, and sometimes for me. I liked watching patrons recognize work without knowing its origin story. It felt cleaner that way. The restaurant was a place where my childhood lessons and my kitchen scars overlapped, and in that overlap I learned that success doesn't have to be loud or cruel to be real. I kept calling, kept sending cards, and kept my distance until I could meet them not to be seen, but to be known. The envelope arrived the way the Reynolds family always sent things, embossed, heavy, the kind of paper that announces money before the words do, and I felt an old tightening in my chest when I saw my sister's name on the invite. It was an invitation to her engagement party at Asteria, a Saturday night under my own roof folded into nicer paper than I had ever had the patience for. I held the card for a long time, thinking about what going back would mean. I said yes not because I wanted applause, but because I wanted a kind of closure. I wanted to see the people who had judged me in a room I had built without them. That night I wore a suit I had chosen with precise calm, navy, and unflashy, the cut roomy enough to remember long hours on a line and close enough to mean I cared. The maitre d' met me with a blink that read like surprised respect. Aaron had worked the room since we opened and knew faces at 50 paces. He slid me aside and murmured, "Good to see you." It was small, but it was the acknowledgement I had taught myself to crave instead of their voices. Walking in, I felt the air change. The dining room was soft with low light, a string of murmurs and the scent of lemon verbena riding the air like a memory I had asked people to have. The family sat like a carefully set scene at the central table. Emily in a new season dress that hugged the polite contour of our neighborhood's expectations. Alexander across from her, talking in the measured cadence of a Wharton grad on the partner track, his credentials listed by anyone who introduced him as if they were proof of oxygen. My father inspected the leather-bound wine list with a small, theatrical nod that felt practiced. He tasted like someone who studied his identity with vintages. My mother fluttered with the exact amount of pride she was trained to display, peals of laughter placed like accent marks. Matt looked like a matte photograph in a pressed suit, the kind of son who had been polished into investment company branding. Service arrived like choreography. I watched more than I spoke, tasting in the margins because it felt less ridiculous to listen than to explain. The amuse-bouche came first, a compressed cucumber and almond bite that was cold and clean and meant to wake the mouth. I saw Emily lift hers politely, Alexander making an appreciative hum that meant good manners. There were small, quick remarks from my father, loud enough for practice. "Delicate portions," he said, the tone balanced between critique and curiosity like a man checking inventory. A cousin leaned in with a smirk and asked if I could support a family habit with this kind of work, as if money and meaning were synonyms for a job title. By the heirloom tomato course, I felt the room prickling with a different energy. Tomatoes cut like stained glass sat on plates that made color feel curated. Someone made a joke about not enough meat, and the word servant floated like lint in a sunbeam, a fatherly aside wrapped in false concern. I kept my face even, tasting the vinaigrette that sang of basil I had sourced for this season, and watched Alexander explain in that quiet way partners do how his firm optimized similar margins. Each course pulled at old threads, the scallops grilled with char and smoke, the duck breast scored and lacquered, the deconstructed lemon tart that arrived like a question. Between bites came the loaded query, first voiced with a sneer and then repeated like a taunt. "How are you paying for this place?" They asked it more than once, the question curling into cruelty the more it was said. It landed in the room like a dropped plate, and I could sense the staff stiffen a hair, servers moving with the practiced calm we trained to protect diners from noise. I could have answered with numbers, brandished invoices, recited the steam of my sacrifices like a lawyer in response to cross-examination. Instead, I listened to the cutlery, the low hum of other tables, and the sound of my sister laughing at something Alexander said. The question hung there, waiting for me to shrink or to set something down. I tasted lemon, thyme, and the old heat of a kitchen that had taught me how to hold a moment without breaking it. Emily's accusation landed like cold metal across the table before the check even came, and I felt it like a sting on skin that's already been burned. She leaned forward, eyes sharp with something like hurt and something like showmanship, and said in that clipped way she used when she wanted everyone to agree with her, "So this is paid for by a boyfriend, a benefactor, or is daddy finally fronting your hobbies?" Her voice held the old town's currency, shame dressed as curiosity. I heard the question in the air, the loaded echo I had learned to expect, "Can you even afford this?" And Alexander, with the practiced bravado of someone who'd been taught to close every moment with a card, reached for his wallet like a man seizing a plot point. The maitre d' had been watching. Aaron had the short, steady breath of someone who had seen too many scenes to be surprised by any of them, but he watched me with a flash of something like concern. The check arrived in a leather folder that smelled faintly of polish and lemon oil, the edges creased from 100 polite arguments before hours. Alexander's hand was already halfway across the table, fingers closing as if the right payment could seal the conversation. Robert made a small show of looking indignant. Susan pursed her lips in the exact way that had taught me to fold anger into decorum. Matt was smiling like this was all theater. I could feel the kitchen through the floor, a low, steady pulse like a heart-counting service, and I kept my hands on the linen because I had learned to steady my own pulse first. Aaron opened the folder with the same calm he used when he greeted a nervous guest, and the room held its breath like a theater before the curtain. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make the reveal dramatic. He looked at me briefly, a small nod of recognition, and then met the table with a voice that was precise and kind. "Good evening," he said. "Thank you for dining with us tonight. I wanted to let you know the evening's food has been taken care of." He placed the folded folder on the table without flourish, palms flat like a man placing a fact down that could not be argued with. Then, almost as if he were reading from a menu of truths, he added, "Asteria is owned and run by Logan Reynolds, executive chef and proprietor." Silence tightened like a lid. The napkins stopped moving in people's hands. Someone in the corner dropped a fork and the sound was loud enough to break the stillness, and then the silence swallowed it again. The staff, trained to protect guests from noise, held themselves in the exact posture we practiced, composed, polite, invisible authority in white shirts and quiet moves. Their faces said a kind of protocol pride, eyes that had seen the door open from the other side and knew the rules by heart. The statement wasn't a curtain call. It was a fact placed between polite linens and a leather folder, and the power was in how plainly it sat there. Emily went pale in the way of someone who had built an argument on sand. Her mouth opened and closed for a beat before she found a different shape of sentence. Robert's hand, which had been steady on the wine list, trembled a single hair before he cleared his throat like someone trying to find a line they forgot. Alexander's card hovered useless in his fingers, suddenly a child's toy. My mother folded her hands over her mouth as if to stop words that had been waiting a long time to tumble out. Matt looked away like he was trying to dodge the new light on our table. The question of "how are you paying for this?" hit them now with a slow, dawning clarity because the ledger of the evening had been closed on facts they couldn't dismiss. I felt the room press against me the way a hot pan presses against a hand until you stop noticing the heat. My breath was steady, because the years in the kitchen teach you to hold a heat and not flinch until it's time to move. I watched Aaron fold the leather folder back the way he'd opened it, a small, exact motion, and felt a strange, clean relief, no fanfare, no gloat, only the quiet set-down of a long truth. The staff shifted, the room exhaled without knowing it, and for a moment I saw my hands as they really were. Scarred, steady, the hands that had earned this place one burn and one long night at a time. The silence wasn't empty. It was the space where new facts settle and old judgments lose their weight. I let Aaron's words sit on the table, and then I spoke in a voice that had practiced holding heat without flinching. I didn't shout or parade numbers like trophies. I said simply that the restaurant began with roughly $2.8 million in development capital, raised with the help of 2 early partners and an investor who walked in after tasting my food and decided to back the work, not my last name. I told them I used business skills I learned in school differently than they expected. I tracked margins, negotiated leases, and planned for seasons. I said the partner buyouts came later, when numbers made the choice possible, and that I used the restaurant's performance, bank-backed loans, and reinvested profit to consolidate ownership in a transaction that cost about $1.2 million total to settle and make the business mine. I talked about the years people don't see. The months sleeping in a small Queens room, the loans for school, the 3-a-day shifts, and the nights I came home with my hands blistered and a notebook of corrections. I told them how Laurent pushed me until I could hold a line on a bad night, how Gavin offered a check because he believed the food deserved a stage, and how I chose to buy myself out not for revenge but to take responsibility. I mentioned the cookbook I'm writing in the margins of service, a book about technique and flavor and the way food can hold memory. The numbers were fact, the work was story. I refused to make their disbelief into a spectacle. I refused to gloat, that felt small. Then I set terms. I said I would host a rehearsal dinner tasting for Emily as a sincere gift, not a marketing event, not a networking opportunity. I meant it as a hand extended, not a handout. But I made it clear what would not happen. They couldn't use Asteria to open doors for friends without my consent, they couldn't try to trade on my name for any family business scheme, and they couldn't manipulate me with old emotional debts expecting discounts or favors. I told them I would not tolerate private calls asking for backdoor reservations or for staff to be pressured to serve a name rather than the work. I said those were the terms if we were to move forward with anything involving the restaurant. My staff stood with me without a show. Marcus Mysus folded his arms in that quiet way that says someone will answer with work, not words. Ivy, our front-of-house manager, held her head high because she had earned every reservation and every good review by teaching service to respect the food and protect the team. Chef Sophia, who runs pastry and who fought her way in at a time when kitchens were harder still to break into, gave me a look that said she would back boundaries I set for the people who show up and do the work. They were not props in my story. They were witnesses to the years of scars and nights and decisions. I made a point to say their names out loud at the table and to say thank you in a way my mother could hear. I defended them in the small ways that matter. I told my family that staff would not be asked to pick up private family favors, that gratuities and tip pools would remain protected, and that any requests for special treatment would have to come through me and be fair to every other guest. When my sister's expression wavered into something softer, I reminded myself that soft does not always mean changed. I wanted them to know the rules up front because the people who carry a restaurant through service are people, not extensions of a family's social card. After the talk, I left the table with no dramatics. I hugged Marcus and Ivy briefly in the kitchen doorway, and Sophia pressed a finished tart into my hand like a benediction. Returning to the line felt like stepping back into truth. The knives were cold and familiar, the hoods hummed like a steady heart, and the staff slid into the rhythm we had all made together. I wiped a smear of lemon on my hand and sat at the prep table to write the introduction to the cookbook by the light of a single bulb. The words came easier than I expected because I was finally speaking to people who had seen what I had built. I went home later that night with grease under my nails and a small, quiet peace. The family would thaw in pieces and on their own timetable, or maybe not, and that was no longer my business. My work and the people who did it with me were my measure now. I had offered grace without forfeiting dignity, and that felt like a kind of victory that did not need a witness besides the team I returned to every morning. The next morning after the dinner, I woke to the small, ordinary sounds of the city sirens in the distance, someone arguing cheerfully on a stoop, and felt a weight I had carried for years shift a hair to the side. I didn't expect miracles. I expected the slow, real work of ungluing old habits. A week later, Emily texted, short and awkward, asking if I could meet for a Sunday brunch somewhere simple in the East Village. I almost said no because my calendar is always an argument between service and sleep, but I went because closure isn't a finish line you cross alone. Sometimes it is a table you have to sit at with the people who once named you. The cafe smelled like coffee and toast, nothing at all like the linen and leather of that night, and the choice felt deliberate on her part, a place where no one could pretend title mattered. She slid into the booth and handed me a newspaper clipping folded in a way that made the edges soft. It was a review of Asteria that had run in a weekend paper, the kind of outside notice my family had loved in other contexts. She said this was good, and the apology came out thin and then steadier. "I'm sorry for what I said," she said, words that landed like a small, real thing on a table that used to hold rehearsed opinions. I let her apology sit. I didn't hug or rage. I listened because progress looks like sentences that arrive late and are imperfect. Other gestures came in small doses. My mother sent a card that wasn't the polished scroll it used to be. Inside, she had clipped a line from a magazine that mentioned Asteria in a list of places to watch. Robert passed along an email thread where a colleague had asked how we had built the business model. It wasn't exactly pride typed in bold, but it was a start. Matt texted a link to an investor profile with my name in it, a digital bookmark placed carefully on his feed. None of these things erased old slights, and I made it clear I wouldn't accept hollow praise or cheap social credit. I told them gifts and clippings didn't shorten the work I had done, and they didn't replace the boundaries I had set. That was uncomfortable for them and quiet relief for me. I put the thaw in the same drawer as every other new thing, work first, people second, unless they wanted to meet me where I actually lived. The next steps I laid out to myself and to anyone who asked were simple and practical. The cookbook will be finished within 18 months, 120 recipes and personal essays about what it means to cook through life. It will not be vanity, it will be a map for people who don't come from kitchens. I'm building a mentorship program that will bring young cooks from under-resourced neighborhoods into paid apprenticeships at Asteria, a program with a stipend and real paths to industry work. This is how I pay the city back for taking a chance on me. I also made sure the legal frame around my name was clear. We drafted licensing terms that mean no one, family included, may use Asteria or my name for profit without a formal agreement. If anyone wants to label a product or a service with my brand, it will be licensed and contracted with real terms and fair compensation. I said this bluntly in a family email and then in person more than once, because people who learn to trade and influence need facts like anyone else. That was not spite. It was protection for the people who work here and for the work itself. On slower days, I work on the mentorship curriculum, on nights off I draft recipes, and on the quietest mornings I make time to sit in the dim dining room after closing. That's where I end most days now, the lights soft and steady above the island, a notebook open in front of me, a pen that has traveled through many kitchens pressed to the paper. I write the prologue to the cookbook with a hand that knows its own marks, and for once I'm not trying to prove anything to the house where I grew up. I built a life that fits my hands, and the honest sound of pans cooling around me says more than any family seal ever could. The city remembers my work because it tastes true, and that truth is enough.